Hello, everyone. Welcome to this. This is, of course, measuring what matters, how women are critical to pandemic recovery. Now, this is a special live program which is produced to you by GZERO Media. This in partnership with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. My name is Tumelo Mothotoane. I'm a senior news anchor with eNCA. But today, though, for the reason we are here, now we'll be looking at the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on women globally, as well as the opportunity to, of course, build more equitable and prosperous tomorrow if the right decisions, of course, are made at the right time, which is now. Now, you'll be hearing from some of the world's best experts on this topics. They are top experts in health, in economics, as well as in equality. And you could see, of course, them right in front of your screen. But not only them, we were keen to hear from you as well, and you could do so by, of course, throughout the event, sharing your reactions with us to poll questions that we have posted on social media, and you can vote live. Remember this, you can vote live and interact with us. If you're on GZERO's site right now, you will see a chat window. Where will you find this? Just at the right of the video screen on a desktop, or even below the player on a mobile device. Of course, simply just sign in there to cast your vote on the following poll question. Now, here's the poll question for now. What pandemic result will have the largest and long-lasting impact on women? But I suppose not just long-lasting, longest lasting is the key word there. You can either vote job losses, childcare crisis, or even education losses. Now, while our live viewers, of course, casting their vote, here's how GZERO social media followers have responded. We've got those results, and here they look. 31% of our participants voted job losses, but 41% thought childcare crisis is one to look out for, and that 28% of our participants thinking and believing that education losses will see the longest impact. All right, well, let's get into the scope of this crisis. And delving into this, it's time to introduce a guest who can help us unpack this question. Dr. Okito Vanessa Wedi is a global health and development expert, as well as the founder and CEO of Creative Development. Dr. Wedi, welcome. Good to have you.
Hi there. Thank you so much for having me.
Good to have you. Now, let's get straight into it. I mean, we're specifically going to be addressing, of course, women and the pandemic. But first, it has been more than 18 months now since the World Health Organization had declared COVID-19 a pandemic around the world. But please just explain to our viewers at this point where we are at. And I mean this from the continued spread of the virus all the way to vaccination efforts.
Absolutely. And I'm happy to give a quick summation, and apologies in advance, it might be a little statistic heavy. But just to sum up where we are right now, as it stands, over 244 million cases of COVID-19 has been confirmed. And this looks like, this is quite devastating, as we're nearing almost 5 million deaths from the COVID-19 epidemic, which is quite devastating if you think about it. And coming back to the question on the vaccine efforts that have been put towards this, well, at this particular moment, over 8.4 billion vaccine doses have been distributed globally, which sounds fantastic. However, only 3.1% of people living in low-income countries have actually been able to receive at least one vaccination dose. So again, this kind of shows us this very peculiar picture of, with all the challenges that we're facing around, this global vaccine effort that we're all putting in, probably the biggest problem still stands around the question of equality, or really the lack of it. And so with, all these high-level PC talks around the moral failure, the human stain with this particular issue, for me, frankly, it's quite disgusting when you think about the fact that this is still going on in the 21st century. As an African myself, who, we've seen on the continent have suffered really the brunt of this inequality, only not even achieving or just over 5% of full vaccinations on the continent. This is something that has been perpetuating and really something that we as a society need to reckon with.
Absolutely. And while we look at the society and societal impact there, Dr. Wedi, I mean, I want to further examine this from a different angle. First, the acute issue on COVID-19 itself, looking at the AP and other outlets here who've reported that misinformation, that stigma and fear have actually taken a toll on vaccine uptake for women, particularly in African countries. Now, is that the case? And do you believe access to vaccine has actually been equitable?
So to answer your question, I think it's important to first start off by saying that data around the gender breakdown of vaccine distribution is lacking. It's severely lacking, and critical work needs to be done to really see this area of work become quite robust in the way that we need it to be. But with the few numbers that we do have, there's definitely a suggestion that yes, there is a problem, particularly with women of reproductive age. And so if we're thinking about low economic countries, such within sub-Saharan Africa, within the Middle East, Asia, and the different social and economic dynamics at play within there. This is something that needs to become critically to the fore when we think about, vaccination campaign designs, because again, within a society where there is fear or this perceived fear around, subfertility and the fact that, you might not be able to have children, and children, being the symbol of wealth, of status, of success in your community, and the other barriers that we know that have been up against, women, such as needing permission from husbands to be able to, access medical services, not having access to the technologies or the literacy to even be able to navigate the medical health system, or just vaccination prioritization list that doesn't include you. All these things are factors that have added, to this blockage that we've seen in terms of women being able to access this vaccines. And also, let's not forget that all of this is propagated by the fact that there is this widespread misinformation that has been led to propagate over the months. And this has largely also been due just with the delay that we've been seeing within the vaccines coming to, poorer countries. And so all of these things are things that we need to grapple with. They've all added to the obstacles that we're trying to face. But this again is why, in terms of designs around vaccine campaigns and programs that are meant to reach, those that sit at the heart of these situations, we need to take the voices and the perspectives of these communities, these demographics into account as we think about the strategies that would help us improve vaccine uptakes, particularly within these hard to reach settings, particularly within these hard to reach marginalized groups such as women.
Right. So, Dr. Wedi, then staying with vaccine accessibility, particularly in Africa, allow me to ask you this. I mean, you tweeted a comparison to HIV drugs that were actually available back in the 90s, but took more than a decade to reach Africa. Do you see that happening again here?
Well, yes, and I must say, a little caveat, I was quite upset the day I wrote that tweet, but absolutely, I definitely think that there are similarities when you think about, the AIDS epidemic and what happened there and what we've been able to see up until now in regards to the COVID-19 pandemic. There are eerie similarities all over the place. As with HIV/AIDS, the response to the coronavirus has been one that has been defined by inequalities, where you have those with, high purchasing power able to snatch up very limited resources. For years after the life-saving antiretroviral drugs were widely made available within rich countries, you still found countries, low-income countries, who were unable to access these drugs, which led to millions of deaths. And so we are seeing this kind of repetition right now, and it's quite discouraging if you think about the fact that more people died of AIDS after we got, access to this life-saving cocktail, and those largely outside of these rich countries, just because of the fact that they were not able to access them. And it was only within the mid 2000s, the mid 2000s, after millions of lives were lost, after massive pressure, massive protests and activism were galvanized around this issue, where we actually saw things change and the drug access expand. And so you would think with such a disheartening scenario that something like this would never be allowed to happen again. And yet here we are. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm sure you agree with me, Dr. Wedi, that the HIV pandemic then did affect women. We're seeing the same pattern now with COVID-19. It's in many other aspects of how COVID-19 as a pandemic has affected women's health and well-being. So I want to just touch on this. You in publishing that report titled The Shadow Pandemic, focused on rather increased violence and sexual abuse worldwide. Can you explain that for us, please?
Absolutely. So I think this is quite a well documented phenomena where we have seen increase in gender-based violence really in any type of emergency, whether it be an economic crisis, whether it be a pandemic, whether it be a disease outbreak or conflict. And COVID-19 has been no different. And so when you had the initiation of lockdowns that happened all over the world, governments calling for people to stay at home, to keep themselves safe in the midst of a COVID pandemic, what we remember that many women, countless women all over the world, who are, the home is not a safe space. And this exponential increase in domestic violence taking place all over the world. And so if you think about it, you have this pre-existing toxic social norms together with, inequalities that and actually being in a pandemic, losses of jobs, anxieties about the future, the restriction of movement, all of these coming to dominate in what in effect was a perfect storm, and what turned partners into abusers, and what exacerbating existing situations of abuse. This again was not just seen within domestic violence cases. This was seen across the board. When you think about women losing, economic opportunities and having to step into the informal sector, and being at increased risk of sexual violence and harassment and abuse in Nigeria and Cameroon, looking at girls in India who have increased pressure around rethinking about child marriage as the only viable option to access education and livelihoods in these uncertain times. South Africa, our home, our beautiful home, where we saw within the national helpline for abused women and children, we saw a 100% increase within 3 weeks of the lockdown being announced in March of last year. So again, the situation is not new. It is persistent, it is widespread, it's systemic, and it is a devastation to the human spirit and to human rights.
Sure. You are actually just reiterating the reality that women and young girls have to face, not only in the continent, but also globally. So another sub-theme here, unfortunately, that I want to also touch on is education, right? And we know that before COVID, education was already a major problem for girls globally, particularly in these poorest countries that we see around the world. I mean, for example, here, Dr. Wedi, in Guinea, Mali, Pakistan, over 80% of poor girls spend just 2 years or even less in schools. But do you think the last 2 years have exacerbated that? And so how do you think it has?
So the education crisis has definitely impacted, I think, the progress that has been made over the last 20 years. When you think about, our achievements that have been made towards gender equality, towards education, and you think about, the role of girls and women and the importance of education. I personally would not be here, if it wasn't for education. And so thinking about this kind of situation again, and the incidence of, and how this incidence varies within different countries. One of the things that is clear across the board that school closures increases the risks of girls being exposed to sexual violence and abuse, being exposed to forced labor, child marriages, early pregnancy, teenage pregnancy. These are several factors that are into play here. And whether it be, we can even look at it in previous pandemics, such as Ebola or post-conflicts, where we did see adolescent girls at increased risk of dropping out of school and less likely to return to school after the crisis, which again is why it is so pertinent that we keep girls in school and that governments and partners work together to really tackle and address, the gender dimensions of a pandemic, such as ensuring that schools have the resources, that teachers have the skills to be able to help young girls re-engage with their education once it is possible.
Mm-hmm. I'm taking note of what you're saying, and as I prepare to ask you, my next question, I'm just thinking about how you said, Tumelo, when I tweeted, about, HIV and vaccines, so I was a bit upset, I was a bit displeased, and I'm sure a lot of women can also admit that they are displeased and upset with the next question I'm about to ask you, Dr. Wedi. It speaks about women who have been, obviously the majority caregivers. We see this in stats. I mean, 70% globally, at least throughout this pandemic, be they paid workers or unpaid. Let's talk a bit about the emotional and psychological impact this has had. And we know that as we even answer this question, unfortunately, a majority of women who still continue to be caregivers in this pandemic, they're still unpaid. There's still so much, there's still a gap there when we see in women being remunerated for their efforts.
Absolutely. So as we all know, caregiving has been chronically under-resourced, undervalued, and unpaid. And that responsibility largely falls on the shoulders of young women and girls. And when you think about people who have to take care of loved ones, whether it be family members, whether it be friends, whatever the case might be, they're often grappling with, varying challenges, such as, trying to juggle a paid job in many cases, together with, caregiving responsibilities at home, as well as also just trying to take care of their own needs and their own health, which often, takes a step back, as we all know. And not enough noise actually has been made around this particular issue. And, the research is there. One most recent would be, the Embracing Caregiver survey, which was led by Merck, which clearly showed that, people, men and women, who have to take on the majority, significant share of the responsibility in terms of caregiving responsibilities, with very little to almost no help, often suffer emotional and physical stresses such as depression, anxiety, burnout. All of these things, these are real realities. And, you can forget, going to a hospital and trying to see someone to get help for, these issues, because again, this kind of comes against, the caregiving responsibilities that you have at home, which only means then you're at further increase, to fall ill and need care for yourself. So I think, again, this is one of the reasons why a conversation like this is so pertinent in terms of how do we think beyond the traditional metrics. One of the big issues when we think about the caregiving economy has been the fact that the contribution of care workers has not been recognized within traditional economic productivity indicators. And now in society, as we are grappling with, how do we build forward better? How do we place value on people, on the contributions of women, of youth, of the historically marginalized? This question of value, this question of value, of respect, of acknowledgement, of recognition needs to come back into the fore. And yes, maybe they don't fit quite neatly within the traditional economic metrics that we have come to understand today, but we saw within the COVID pandemic that these were the bedrocks. It was our mothers, it was our nurses, it was, our doctors who are in the majority women, who are able to sustain us. And so as we are grappling with these issues and trying to negotiate and reconcile, how we build forward better, I think these things need to come to the fore because they are just as important, and I would argue maybe even more so.
Well, Dr. Wedi, I can't thank you enough for your time today. Thank you so much for speaking to us today. All right, that's Dr. Okito Vanessa Wedi joining us. And well, let's move to this. And up next, it was, dubbed the She Session. Heard of that before? It is a real thing. Now, last year, women lost more than 64 million jobs. This amounted to an estimated $800 billion in lost earnings alone. However, of course, experts say that women returning to the workforce could also be the key to a lot more robust and lasting economic recovery. So joining me right now is Ms. Manoush Shafiq, Director of the London School of Economics and Political Science, and the author of What We Owe Each Other, a new social contract for a better society. Manoush, thank you for your time and welcome.
It's a real pleasure to be with you, Tumelo.
I'm excited for this one. A lot to unpack here. But first, the word better, right, is right there in the middle of your book, right at the title of your book. We see this when you get a hold of the book. And we have heard Building Back Better from President Biden, from UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, as well as New Zealand's Jacinda Ardern, and many, many more, Manoush at that. So simply put, is the world actually building back better, do you think?
Not yet. I think the fact is we're still in the crisis. And I think, as Dr. Wedi said, we still have 97% of the population in low-income countries without access to a vaccine. So we haven't even begun to solve the current crisis, much less thinking about building back. I think what this crisis has shown, though, is it showed all the fault lines in our societies. It showed the consequences of people who had precarious work, or children who had no access to digital anything, computers, phones, or to be able to sustain their education. It showed the precariousness of our care systems. It showed how dependent we were on very low-wage workers who did things like nursing and security and maintaining deliveries of food around our societies. And so we haven't built back better, but we sure know where the fault lines are now as a result of the pandemic.
No. And with that being said, I shared some statistics earlier on, Manoush, about job losses and lost income over the last year alone, which, don't really tell the whole story. So I suppose we know at that point as well that there's formal, economy, then there's the informal economy. But can you explain the difference for us?
Yeah. So the formal economy is the economy in which people have contracts, they have benefits associated with that work, and they have predictability about their hours of work and how long they'll work and so on. The informal economy, the informal labor market, is where you don't have any of those things. Traditionally, we've associated the formal labor market with more advanced economies and the informal one with low-income countries. The fact is, informality has become part of the labor market in all countries in the world. Something like a quarter of workers in many advanced economies are also on precarious contracts where they don't know how many hours they'll work every week. Sometimes we call it the gig economy because that sounds a bit sexier, but actually there's nothing very sexy about not having benefits. And so that part of our economy has gotten much more important. And I think it showed that the problems with that revealed itself enormously during COVID. Many people who might have been sick with COVID couldn't afford to not go to work because they wouldn't earn any income and wouldn't be able to feed their families. And I think it really highlighted the fact that we need to move to a world where no matter what kind of employment you have benefits associated with that.
Absolutely. So with that then being said, is bringing my next point here. In July of 2020, this was last year, a much quoted McKinsey report had stated, I just want to quote it, it says, taking action now to advance gender equality could be a lot more valuable, adding $13 trillion to global GDP in 2030, as compared with the gender regressive scenario. So I have to ask you, it's October 2021 right now. Where are we at with this action?
Yes. I mean, we have made so much progress in the world in terms of getting girls into primary and secondary school. And at the university level, globally, we now have more women going to university than men, including in Africa, the Middle East, and in Asia. And all those talented women can contribute hugely to our economies. But the fact is, we haven't put in place systems to enable that talent to be used well. We saw it during the pandemic when children had to be homeschooled. The people who withdrew from the labor market were women who had to stay home and care for their children. And much of that job loss you described, Tumelo, is a result of those circumstances. The talent of all of those women is a huge potential economic gain to our societies. If you look at the United States over a 50-year period, 20 to 40% of the gains in productivity in the US economy came from the fact that employers could now choose not just from a pool of white men for their workers, but from women and Black people and a much broader array of skills. And were much better able to match people to the jobs that suited them most. And that better matching resulted in massive productivity gains. So this is not just about an equality story. This is really an economic efficiency story as well.
Yeah, but I'm sure here there clearly is also an economic argument to be made for inclusive and equitable recovery, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We have a lot of evidence that children of absolutely the same level of skills in subjects like maths and science, whether they succeed and are able to contribute and innovate and increase productivity in the economy depends too much on what family they're born into and where they're born. And, we often call them the lost Einsteins. All of those children who are born into poor families, all of those girls who don't get opportunity, all of those people born into poor communities who, if their talents were able to be put to use, would make huge contributions to innovation and productivity in our economies.
Absolutely. Manish, this then brings me to your book. It details a new social contract here, a need to rethink how societies actually approach social safety nets. And one key aspect actually of that is caregiving and how it's treated and valued. Just please elaborate on that for us.
Yeah. So in the book, I argue that one of the biggest pressures on our social contract today and why it's failing is because of the changing role of women. So our old social contract was premised on the idea that women looked after the young and the old for free with unpaid work. But today, with all of these women educated, it isn't efficient for them to look after the young and the old for free. And it's a lost opportunity if we don't find a better system to enable them to use their talents in the labor market. And so in the book, I argue that we need to think about the care system, just like we have an educational system and a health system. We need to create an infrastructure of care that supports women to continue to stay in work. And it's not surprising that the countries that do the best in keeping women in work and earning incomes are countries that provide publicly supported high-quality childcare. It can be in the form of vouchers so that people can buy care, or it can be in public provision. But the countries that do that well have very high rates of female labor force participation. And those women become part of dual earner households and are able to improve the well-being of their families.
Right. I just want to just elaborate further on that, because I'm thinking of the African context right now. So we're talking about women as primary caregivers, at least for the young and the old. How would you then advise, or what do you think, or how do you think we can dismantle some of the historical beliefs that says, a woman's pride is in caregiving the young and the old for free? It's what defines her, what makes her valued within the community. These are some of the patriarchal historical beliefs in some of these communities that are small, have strong traditional belief systems. How do you think that we can begin at least to dismantle these?
Well, I think education is the key, and both for the communities that hold those views to see possibly that there are different ways of organizing things, but also for those women. And as those women become more educated, and as those girls see the potential that they have, I think they will be at the forefront of pushing for change and asking for more support support from their families and their partners in caring for children, support from the state in terms of supporting better public quality childcare, and also elderly care. And this is an economic investment, because those women will increase productivity, they'll increase incomes in their communities and in their families, and they'll pay tax. And that tax can then pay for good quality childcare and good quality elderly care. So this is a virtuous cycle.
I agree. Education is the key to unlocking that knowledge. Now, I want to share another viewer poll question now. I mean, before the live stream, we had posed the following question to viewers. Let me remind you of this as well. This is our poll that I'd like to actually bring to you now. What will the world look like for women after the pandemic? Greater equality, setback, inequality, or no significant change? So as a reminder, those of you watching live can actually vote as well. And here are the results, though, based on the votes from social media users. All right, so just 17%, as you can see there, believe there will be greater equality after the pandemic. And 31% think there will be a setback. But look at that, 51% actually think there will be no significant change at all. Manoush, with that being said, I have to bring you into this. What do you hope will happen? Do you see any silver linings right now?
Yeah, well, I think we don't know yet, because we're still in the crisis. And big political changes often come about after crises. And I think this is a moment when things might change. I would love to see a society, and what I hope for is a moment when we say, you know what, our old social contract was broken. We need something different. And we need a set of arrangements that give people greater security as well as better opportunity. We've seen the costs of insecurity, the costs of not having good public healthcare systems, the costs of people working without having benefits associated and any social insurance associated with their work. And so I think there will be a demand from most populations for greater security, better healthcare, better certainty around sick leave and pay. And then we also need to do much more on opportunity for everyone to be able to fulfill their potential. And there, I think more investments, particularly in the early years when children are shaped hugely by what happens to them from age 0 to 3, but also throughout life, and as well as through one's adult years. We're moving into a world in which we have to use all of the talent of everyone, and I hope that this pandemic will be a moment when we reassess how we've done. I think, to be frank, I don't think our track record has been great. It's probably, I've spent 25 years of my life working in the international economic system, and this is probably the worst failure of international cooperation that I've seen in my life. You could not have written a case study of a crisis that would have required more international cooperation. A global pandemic, international spillovers, affects everyone, and yet we haven't done so well. We haven't done very well, and I hope it's a bit of a wake-up call for us that we need a fairer system, and a part of a fairer system has to be one which taps into the talent of all the women in the world.
Yeah, that's food for thought. And I thank you so much for joining me, Manoush Shafiq. I appreciate your time today. All right, so we have discussed the scope of and scale actually of the crisis, and humanitarian and economic reasons why women are vital to global recovery. But now comes that hard part, right? The question is, what should we do about it? Well, joining me now, there are three people who no doubt have a lot to say. Firstly, Mlambo-Ngcuka is the former executive director of UN Women and a former deputy president of the Republic of South Africa. We're also joined by Ian Bremer, who's the president of Ranger Group and GZERO Media, but also joining us is Mr. Mark Suzman, who's the CEO of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Gentlemen, lady, welcome. Thank you for joining me.
Good to be with you.
Now, I need to start with you, Mamphumzile. I want to start by hearing your perspective on, what we've just discussed so far. And if I may just give you this opportunity to also mute yourself as you prepare to answer, Mlambo-Ngcuka. I mean, where do you see women globally just nearly 2 years into this pandemic? What's your perspective?
Well, thank you very much, and good evening to everybody, and good afternoon for some of you. We unfortunately still have a lot of women who are caught up in the crossfire that is not of their own making. A lot of women, as we know, lost jobs during the pandemic. In fact, it is estimated across the world 2/3 of the jobs that were lost by women. So making a re-entry into the formal economy is quite difficult. Many of the women do not have the skills that are required in the turnaround in some cases. Women that were in the informal sector have a difficulty of starting up again. And the economic incentives that were brought forward by governments were not targeted to women enough. So women fell between the cracks. But also the sectors of the economy that were affected by COVID tend to have a large number of women working in them. Tourism, hospitality, those are sectors that have a lot of women. So in many of the developing countries, the countries that need help most, it is quite hard for women. And then on the issue of violence against women, the reports that we see do not suggest that it has been sustained at that level that it was when it shook all of us. But we've left a lot of women with scars, and violence against women, as it normally does, continues. And it's already very high under normal circumstances when we are not dealing with the pandemic. And that is why the notion of a shadow pandemic suggests to us that this is a problem that is going to stay with us. So we should not say because there is no lockdown anymore, we must retreat and not deal with it. It certainly is one of those problems that we have to deal with as vociferously as we can until we can bring it down. And you've said it, and the other speakers have said it, the issues of unpaid care, the issue of unpaid care. I have seen that some governments have come up with incentives. Some governments are specifically wanting to address and speak about unpaid care for the first time, but that's a drop in the ocean. The overwhelming number of governments are not even going there. So whenever people talk about us coming out of the pandemic, I am just saying that this applies to some people. It certainly does not apply to many women. Many women are not coming out of the pandemic. The pandemic is staying with them, actually.
That's a very, unfortunate reality, Mlambo-Ngcuka, that you paint for us. And I suppose that's why I need to bring in Ian at this point. I mean, Ian, the concept of GZERO itself, a world where little to no global cooperation seems more feasible, seems very much on display here. But how are you viewing this, right, from a geopolitical perspective?
First, nice to see all of my friends here and delighted to be a part of this, truly. You know, when I think about the geopolitical environment we're in right now and how it affects women, what does it mean that there's a lack of global leadership? It means that the United States doesn't want to act as the global policeman, but no one else is prepared to step into that role. The US doesn't want to be the architect of global trade, but we have an absence of global leadership in response to that. It's not just about that. It's also about values and rule of law and basic human dignity that the Americans are imperfect at, but certainly better historically than what we see in much of the developing and least developed part of the world. And if the US is not capable of doing that and no one else is stepping in, what does that mean for the treatment of women? What does it mean if the United States is not taking the leadership role on the distribution of vaccines, as Okito Wedi said at the beginning, and no one else is prepared to really stand up for that? Climate, I can keep going on. But what it means in 2021, well, how about one place we haven't talked about yet? There are 20 million women in Afghanistan. What does it mean that there's a lack of global leadership for those 20 million women today living under the Taliban? I mean, their opportunities in terms of education, in terms of mobility, in terms of social life, in terms of entertainment, in terms of just having a life, it no longer exists in a way that any of us on this call could say meets bare bones acceptability in a 21st century world. And yet that's precisely where we are. In a world where the Americans are pivoting away from the Middle East, but the Europeans aren't going to play that role, the Chinese aren't going to play that role. What does it mean for women in Yemen? What does it mean for women that are forced refugees? I mean, all of the people coming from Haiti in my own backyard, the Western Hemisphere, that are being sent back to the poorest and most challenging environment right here in our backyard. And most of them are women. And that's an enormous, and children, that's an enormous challenge. And so look, I do think that on the pandemic, we're going to see geopolitically that the availability of vaccines simply through science and production in the next 12, 18 months is going to remove a lot of the immediacy of the hardship in this extraordinary crisis that we're presently facing. But also, as Phumzile said, the scarring that will occur because the developed world has the money to ensure that our wages are not going down, our level of absolute poverty is not increasing. But the poorest countries in the world, anyone that saw the IMF report on Africa over the last couple of days that showed that, I mean, literally permanent reduction in income, also the part of the world that will take the longest to get the vaccines, the part of the world that will be affected the strongest by climate change that we're not responding to effectively. Who is that? Whose shoulders are those grievances, those challenges going to fall onto? Everyone on this call knows the women. And that it seems to me is the biggest challenge of a G0 world, is all of this takes longer, and the gap actually among the poorest, the most dispossessed on the planet, actually grows larger. Even as we're doing wonderful things, important things, showing real progress in the wealthiest parts of the world.
Right. And Mark, it seems your organization's founder, Melinda Gates, reiterates, right, Ian's sentiments here in the first round of a statement. And I just want to quote it. It reads that the global fight for gender equality began decades ago. However, progress has been slow. Mark, why has it been slow? And where do you see the greatest need right now?
Yeah, well, thank you. And thanks to all my fellow panelists for joining this already a great discussion. And you're right, progress hasn't been good enough. We're highlighting, and you've heard from everybody about the challenges that have been accentuated and made much more visible by the COVID pandemic, such as the she-cession and the disproportionate economic impact on women in terms of job losses and caregiving. But those are highlighting challenges that are not new. The Beijing Women's Declaration itself, which was cited right at the start of this session, set out a very visionary agenda. It just wasn't followed up. Phumzile herself just led, it was supposed to be the 25th anniversary, ended up being the 26th anniversary of the Beijing Women's Declaration, a great event in Paris, the Generation Equality Forum, designed to try and highlight this and say, why in this world in the 21st century have we not made that progress? Political, economic, social, on both women's rights, women's economic empowerment, women in every corner of society. There have been encouraging signs, but it's so far short of what's needed. And now we are at risk of, as our readers' poll show, or our viewers' poll showed, either staying stagnant or slipping back. And so one of the key reasons is fundamentally structural. At the Gates Foundation, we have a vision that every person, man, woman, deserves the right to a healthy and productive life. That's what drives what we do. But Melinda and Bill, our two founders, would say they were naive when we founded our foundation only 21 years ago about, well, if you take a key area, an economic area like agricultural development, which is one of our priorities, which actually is the largest employer still in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa of men and women, and the largest source of economic growth potentially. And we would think about inputs of how do you get seeds and training and credit and tools and access to markets and all these issues. But then when you unpack it, you look and you say, well, it turns out that women are at least half of all the farm labor, but women have access to smaller plots of land. They're less likely to have title to that land. They're less likely to get credit. They have less time available because they have more caregiving duties. They're less likely to be visited by the government to be provided the extension services and the training they need. So once you start looking at that, you realize unless you take a very deliberate, focused lens on each of those, you're not going to make the overall progress on poverty reduction, increased employment, increased investment in the agricultural sector. And that's true across all the areas where we work. And I think that is the opportunity now, which the world is not yet seizing, that, just as the vaccine inequality scandal, and I think it is a global scandal in terms of that distribution, has highlighted that we don't have the tools and the leadership, as Ian just said, to drive that forward. We have to apply that in and across other sectors. And I do think the issue of the role of women and the follow-up to that forum, which I do encourage everyone to take a look at the action plan that came out of it, because it's very concrete and tangible in areas like women's economic empowerment. And we made a very significant, Melinda Gates made a very significant announcement there of a $2.1 billion commitment by the foundation focused on some key areas like women's economic empowerment and women in leadership. But the short version is you need a much more intentional focus at the governmental level with metrics that require real accountability going forward if we're going to see change.
Right. So Mlambo-Ngcuka, we've identified all these gaps. You've mentioned, your portion about unpaid gap, Mark referencing the lack of vaccine equity around the world. Ian also touching on why it's been taking so long, and basically, saying that even, in the backyard of the United States, we've seen so many, gaps. So what more about the women in, the likes of Yemen, in Afghanistan, for example? It brings me to this. What role then do you think multilateral organizations and NGOs can actually play here? But also, what are the gains, the greatest gains that they also equally can make?
Yeah. Well, right now, governments, especially in poor countries, are cash-strapped. The ability for them to move forward with big, bold steps is something that is not quite likely to happen, not unless they get help. In generation equality, we anticipated that, as Mark has explained. We see the need not just to support civil society, but also to support governments so that they can close the gap. But we have to identify governments who have a plan, because you don't want to support with resources governments who may not do the kinds of things that have been identified as critical for that country. Multilateral organizations are important for that because they can also call on accountability. if they provide resources, they can want to see accountability. And accountability is important right now when we have gone through 26 years of implementing the Beijing Declaration, and we don't have a grand finale. We don't have anything that marvelous to show for it. So we have to start from year one as we review and correct ourselves on the implementation. With the resources, the capacity, the skills of the multilateral organizations, there is a lot that they can offer to countries. But also, if I think of the World Bank, which has been very active in supporting countries to provide economic and financial stimulus, that is critical support. They must call for women to be reflected in the interventions that the governments are doing. It is not enough to give governments to assist those who have been affected. They must say women who are in the informal sector, women who are affected by an unpaid care, etc., so that it is specific and we can see that the women are actually also benefiting from the interventions that can be made by the multilateral organizations.
Right. And on that note, Mlambo-Ngcuka, I'd like to present our final viewer poll today, which is a lot more optimistic one, indeed, I have to say so myself. Now, we'd asked our viewers on social media the following. Now, what would be the most empowering change for women coming out of this pandemic? Do you think perhaps increased work flexibility, recognition of caregiver roles, or better jobs and wages? So this is how people had voted. So you can see right now on your screens, 40% chose increased work flexibility, 24% chose recognition of caregiver roles, and 36% believe that better jobs and wages will actually come from this pandemic. Those are quite interesting views and perspectives there, just in terms of the voter pattern for this viewer question. But I mean, we've also heard from some of the world's top experts, as you have seen, including 3 people that are still with me. And I'd like to give them a chance right now just to offer concluding thoughts at this time before we wrap up our conversation. We've mentioned in this program, if I may add, we aren't really talking about women's issues. We're talking about world issues and how to solve crises that impact all of us, and women make up, obviously, part of it. So in terms of just getting final thoughts, Ian, let me start with you. What would be your parting shots at this moment?
Well, to be optimistic, my final thought would be that a lot of the new technologies that are ramping up with massive investments because of the pandemic are going to prove empowering for women. And perhaps the most important one in the near term was just reflected in that last poll question. I mean, organizations around the world are moving flexible. They're saying you can work from home, or they're saying you can do 2 or 3 days in the office. This is something that will benefit women significantly. And it will help to recognize some of the unique challenges that women have in the formal workplace, particularly in the developed world, but not only in the developed world. I think that that's a big deal. I also think that there is a greater recognition that these issues need to be addressed as part of governance. Just today, I see 1.75 trillion reasons in the United States to get a little bit more optimistic about the new social contract that Manusha's book is all about. So much of that support, it's not done yet. It's going to be a couple months of fighting and gnashing of teeth, but I think it will pass. And when it does, so much of that is about the fabric of what allows women to have a real shot in the United States. It's about childcare. It's about education care. It's pre-K. It's more flexibility. These are things that have continued to make it harder for women to have a spot in the workforce that is equal, even as we do all of this effort to have anti-discrimination, more women in boards, more women in CEOs, but you still have to provide the basic infrastructure for them. And that is fun. This is the largest piece of domestic legislation oriented towards social fabric of the country since Truman's Great Society. And we should not underestimate that from the world's largest economy. And if the US can do that, other countries are going to do more too. So that's a little bit of optimism for me, at least.
Oh, thank you so much, Ian, for that. Mlambo-Ngcuka, your closing thoughts.
Well, I just want to weigh in on digital literacy. If women want a flexible working arrangement, there is an assumption there that women will be able to work everywhere. Given the gender gap in terms of digital skills, this is something we have to address, not just because of the way the question was answered, because just generally we know that these skills are not available for women, including women who will not be in jobs that can decide for them to work at home, women who already work at home because they're in the informal sector. I see this as one of the greatest responsibility of our education systems. I am working in that area now post UN Women. It is part of our action coalition on innovation and technology. I think taking this to schools, ensuring that teachers, parents, communities address this is important so that the future of work is not the future that is without women. It is something that we can all put contribute to and make sure that we increase the number of women that can play a greater role in technology. I have much more to say on this, but let me just be disciplined and stick with one point.
I can see how passionate you are, Mlambo-Ngcuka, about this topic. We can go on and on and on. But thank you so much for those closing comments. And Mark, your closing thoughts, please.
Yes, so, well, with thanks to everybody, let me also try and inject a note of optimism amidst the gloom, where I do think there are some key silver linings. One is that focus on caregiving that we've talked about. And, Ian is correct in that this is social issues are at the heart of this big domestic U.S. debate right now, but it's still telling that the issue of whether childcare is in or out of that package is one of the issues still being vigorously debated on the floor, which it shows you how challenging that still is, even in sort of the largest economy on the planet. That said, one of the announcements we did make also at the Generation Equality Forum, and you mentioned the World Bank, has been the launch and establishment of a global care alliance, which is being much more thoughtful and trying to provide policies and incentive structures for how in low and middle income countries do you set up and fund and resource proper caregiving structures and societies that allow those women who have been forced out of the workforce or never had an opportunity to come in to do so. And I do think there will be some real progress there. And then both Phumzile and Ian just mentioned digital. And I think that digital platform that we've talked about is something that has also been working already for the benefit of women in many areas. But I think we can see an acceleration in, and one of the key areas we're most engaged and most excited in is actually digital financial services. Because again, a silver lining of the last year, it's a silver lining that comes out of a negative, has been a massive expansion of social payments to women across the world, mostly digitally, even in very poor countries. There are nearly 1 billion more people, nearly all women, were added to social payment structures from Pakistan to Kenya to South Africa. And once you have that digital platform, there's a lot of evidence and examples that shows you that can be a platform into larger savings, into more entrepreneurial activity back in agricultural development and areas I talked about. And so I think there are these sort of green shoots that we need to collectively build on and seize and drive forward to make sure that the challenges that have been highlighted by COVID actually are a call to action to have a gender-focused recovery front and center, because that actually will be a faster, more effective, and more equitable recovery for the entire world.
And that will do it for today. I want to thank you all. Mlambo-Ngcuka, Mark, Ian, Manoush, Dr. Wedi, thank you so much for such an insightful conversation. I've learned so much. myself just from you having this conversation with you. But for all of you as well joining us virtually, you can find GZERO's award-winning global affairs content at gzeromedia.com. And remember to also head to gatesfoundation.org for more on the importance of gender equality in society. I am Tumelo Mothotoane, and it's been a pleasure being with you, and have a wonderful day further.